Early humans could find a spring. They could remember where it was. What they could not do was test that water for invisible microbial contamination. So the real puzzle is not how they found clean water. It is how they managed a risk they could not measure. The first part of the answer is access. At Olduvai Gorge in East Africa, evidence shows that freshwater mattered to the environments early humans used. Springs and wetlands created important points in a landscape where water availability could change sharply. Archaeological occurrences there are associated with spring and wetland settings, suggesting that hominins repeatedly used water-linked habitats. Groundwater modeling suggests that some paleosprings may have remained relatively stable, even through long dry periods. That does not tell us the water was microbiologically safe. It tells us something more basic. A dependable source reduces the danger of having no water at all. At Olduvai, water availability was one factor shaping how hominins used the landscape. But reliable water and safe water are not the same thing. Modern field studies make the second problem easier to see. In rural Lesotho, researchers tested 30 drinking water sources and found that conditions around a source were associated with major differences in E. coli contamination. Protected sources could have lower contamination than unprotected ones. But protection did not guarantee safety. Even protected sources could still contain E. coli. Researchers also found associations with conditions around the source, including sanitation and livestock feces. The point is not that prehistoric people understood those variables. It is that microbial risk depends partly on what happens around the water, not just on whether water is present. Another modern river study found that after heavy rainfall, E. coli levels could rise sharply, along with turbidity. These are not windows into Paleolithic behavior. They are modern examples of a principle. Microbial risk can change with the source and with environmental conditions. So we have to be careful. The evidence reviewed here does not establish a universal Paleolithic rule that could identify microbiologically safe water. We cannot turn a simple visual rule into an archaeological fact, and we cannot project a modern wilderness guide backward and call it prehistory. What could people have relied on instead? One possible mechanism is social learning. Studies of living hunter-gatherers, such as the Hadza and Bayaka, show that subsistence skills can be learned from other people through observation, participation, and teaching. Children and adults do not have to solve every practical problem from zero. Skills and knowledge can move between people. That does not prove that Paleolithic groups passed down specific rules about particular springs. The water-specific claim remains an inference, but it does show that humans have a mechanism for preserving useful experience beyond one individual. Knowledge about routes, resources, seasons, and useful practices can persist socially. That gives us a plausible way experience could matter, even without germ theory. A useful practice does not have to come with the correct scientific explanation before it can be learned or repeated. But this still leaves an obvious shortcut. What about boiling? Here the archaeological evidence becomes especially useful, because it tells us both what we can say and what we cannot. At El Mirón Cave in Spain, evidence from the Upper Paleolithic supports the use of heated stones to boil liquids. So people in at least some prehistoric contexts had the technological ability to heat liquid without modern cookware. That sounds like the solution. But it is also the turning point. The ability to boil liquid does not prove that people routinely boiled drinking water in order to kill pathogens. Those are separate claims. Heating could serve cooking or food processing purposes. The surviving evidence does not preserve an intention to disinfect drinking water. So they survived because they boiled everything they drank is much stronger than the evidence allows. Capability is not intent. And the biological shortcut fails too. Prehistoric people were not protected by some perfect immunity to intestinal disease. A Mesolithic burial at Motala in Sweden preserves evidence of intestinal parasites in a hunter-gatherer. That single case does not tell us how the infection was acquired, and it does not measure the burden of waterborne disease across prehistory. But it does rule out the idea that parasites simply did not affect these populations. Now the puzzle becomes clearer. The evidence does not establish a universal test for safe water. There is no evidence for one universal Paleolithic purification system. And there was no perfect biological shield that made contamination irrelevant. The best supported picture is therefore not one perfect solution. It is several layers of control, each addressing a different part of the problem. The strongest evidence begins with access. Freshwater influenced hominin land use at Olduvai, and modeled paleosprings could make some locations more dependable through dry periods. A second possible layer is learned behavior. We know social learning can transmit subsistence skills among living foragers. Applying that specifically to prehistoric water knowledge is an inference, but it provides a credible mechanism by which useful experience could accumulate, rather than disappear with one person. Then comes technology. By the early Neolithic, the evidence becomes much more concrete. Communities in what is now eastern Germany built sophisticated timber-lined wells. For excavated wells contained more than 100 oak timbers, with construction dates between roughly 5,500 and 5,100 BC. The carpentry shows sophisticated woodworking. More importantly for this story, the structures gave communities engineered access to groundwater. A well changes the relationship with water. Instead of depending entirely on a surface source, people can create and maintain access at a chosen place. But even a well does not prove sterile water. It proves control over access. And that is the pattern that survives the evidence. Control over where water is available. Control over whether a dependable source can be reached again. A plausible route for useful experience to spread through social learning. And eventually, direct engineering of water access. None of those requires people to identify microbes. None guarantees that nobody gets sick. They reduce different kinds of uncertainty. So how did ancient humans survive when they could not see what was in their water? The evidence does not support a hidden prehistoric trick for detecting perfectly safe water. It supports a more cautious interpretation. Freshwater access mattered. At Olduvai, some spring systems may have remained dependable through drought. Humans can transmit subsistence skills socially. Some prehistoric groups could heat liquids. Later communities engineered wells. Taken together, those findings are consistent with layered risk reduction rather than perfect microbial knowledge. That conclusion has a limit. We cannot reconstruct a universal Paleolithic water rulebook because the evidence does not preserve one. But we do not need to invent one. The important pattern is not certainty. It is increasing control over parts of the problem that people could actually influence. Where water was available. Whether a dependable source could be reached, how practical knowledge could move between people, and eventually, how access itself could be engineered. They could not test the microbial world inside their water. The evidence suggests that survival did not depend on doing so. It depended on making uncertainty less dangerous, one controllable layer at a time.